Welcome back to the Pirate Republic. This is an audiobook presentation of Pirates of the Wild West, the first novel in the Storm of Time series, released one chapter at a time. This is an action-packed episode, Chapter 19, The Ruse. We catch up with Sam Bellamy and Bart Roberts. You are not going to want to stop or pause this episode. If you're driving to work and all of a sudden you get there and you're still in the middle of it, you're going to be sitting there maybe calling in a little bit late. It was traffic. Come on, they'll understand. Anyway, it's time to sharpen up those cutlasses. Load your flintlocks. Let's find out what's happening on the Charlotte's Fortune. Chapter 19, The Ruse. Black Sam Bellamy watched the 4 barges depart from the wharf of Honolulu Bay through the spyglass he had found in the pilot house of the Charlotte's Fortune. It was a fine instrument made of brass and polished wood, English in origin. The device had a single draw that extended over 3 feet in length. The optics were crystal clear and allowed Sam an enhanced view of the men and large crates that were loaded and crowded on the 4 boats. It seemed that the cabinet minister, Bishop, was living up to the bargain they had struck. He wouldn't know for sure until the crates were brought aboard and opened to reveal their contents. Sam adjusted his view to examine the sailors that rowed the boats, 6 in each. He saw no signs of weapons on the men, but it wouldn't be difficult to hide a pistol or blade under their garb. He handed the spyglass to Chester after having his fill. The older man stared through the glass, moving from boat to boat to make his own assessment. "Looks like we are about to become very rich," Chester said. "Aye, but keep an eye on them and watch the docks for any trouble." Sam moved quickly over the deck that was crowded with armed men with greedy looks in their eyes, as they too watched the approaching boats. He took the stairs 2 at a time to reach the pilot house where Bart was leaning over a nautical map, studying it and making notes. "They're on their way. Looks like Bishop came through. The goods from the hold are on deck waiting to be offloaded. Should I bring up the prisoners?" Sam asked. "Keep them out of sight. Let's make sure the gold is counted. They can start taking the cargo from the hold first." "Aye. Seems easy pirating in these waters. With a ship this size, none would give trouble," Sam said. Bart looked out the window at Honolulu Bay. There were many ships with sails, though most were small fishing vessels. He did see a few sloops and several steamships much smaller than the behemoth they had arrived on. He could see an approaching rain cloud hanging over a dormant volcano. They would be wet in less than an hour. The daily rains in this Pacific Ocean were similar to the Caribbean. Rain would fall hard several times throughout the day for mere minutes before moving on. "She needs cannon, Sammy. We have yet to see a warship, but they are out there. Captain's log tells of 2 iron-built ships with steam engines and turrets, which he describes as rotating cannon mounted on the fore and aft deck. He saw them on his last voyage from Hawaii to that San Francisco." Bart brought over the logbook that was accompanied by several drawings of ships the previously named Lure Line had encountered. Sam looked closely at the detailed drawings. "This one is English," Bart pointed out as they both stared at the sketch of a 3-masted frigate with 2 steam stacks in the center of the deck. Sam wasn't sure as he stared at the drawing if the size ratio of the armaments had been increased for effect or were true to scale. If they were true, they'd be the biggest guns he'd ever seen. "She looks fast as well," he said. "Aye. One thing at a time, though, Sammy. Let's take this king's gold and be on our way back to our mates." The 2 men left the pilot house and watched from the forecastle deck as the barges approached one by one. As the first one was tied off to the Charlotte's Fortune, Bart started down the stairway with Sam following. "Stay alert, lads," he said to the waiting men peering over the rail. "No one likes to give up gold without a fight, so look sharp." The ship had a large, well-engineered hoist to move heavy loads to the deck of the ship from docks, or in this case, other vessels. Bart and Sam waited while the first load was secured to the hoist and began rising to the deck. It contained the smallest of all the crates. 2 men boarded the ship from the barge, and Chester had them searched for weapons. He then turned to Bart and shook his head. Bart approached the 2 men. "Your boat be the one with the gold?" he asked. "Coming up now," said one of the men. They turned and watched the crates crest the railing. Sam looked around at their crew, seeing all eyes were now on these crates. "Quit your gawking! I want eyes on the other boats. Watch for trouble," he yelled. As one, they all turned their attention to the barges, some readying their rifles, but all was calm, and no threat was perceived. Chester and 3 men guided the hoist to set the crates on the deck. They worked to untie the netting, and then, using a pry bar, Chester began to open the wooden boxes. Sam, Bart, and others made their way over to peer inside. The open wooden boxes held a mixture of gold and silver coins and paper money. Bart picked up a few stacks of paper money and looked it over. He gave a questioning look to Chester. Chester took a handful and began to flip through the currency. "Mostly American, but some from England and Mexico. Can't say what the exchange is, but there is enough gold and silver here that it's probably about what you asked for," he said. "It's all there. Mr. Bishop said to assure you," one of the men from the barge piped up. Bart looked at the man, then looked again at the money. "The rest of them crates are supplies?" The man nodded. "Bring up the rest and move the treasure to the forecastle to be counted. Sam, you and Chester, make sure it's all there best as you can." The money was moved from the deck, and the barges began to unload the rest of the larger crates aboard the ship. Once one barge was emptied, it was then loaded with the imports that had been in the Lurline's hold. That cargo filled up most of 4 barges. While that was happening, 6 longboats with just 4 rowers each approached the Charlotte's Fortune to pick up the passengers being held hostage. Bart watched them as they waited for the last of the cargo to be lowered onto the barges. Then, as it pushed away from the ship, the longboats arrived to tie off. "Send down the passengers," a man on the first longboat called up. Bart looked around the deck crowded with large, unopened crates. His men were just milling about discussing what they were going to be doing with their share of the loot. He frowned and shouted at them. "Bring 'em up and get those passengers off my ship!" The men quickened their pace to bring up the passengers from where they were crowded below deck, and Bart wandered through the maze of crates that were as tall as him. He looked at the company labels on their sides as he strode past. Most were Hawaiian-sounding names. The passengers were boarding the longboats as quickly as they could, as most were scared for their lives. Bart turned to watch them as they pushed and shoved to be next to disembark his ship. He was glad to be rid of them. None had had any skills he was needing for his crew. Most looked to be soft, well-to-do folk that he was glad to relieve of their valuables. He longed to get the Charlotte's Fortune back on the open sea, heading for the mainland, back to San Francisco, back to Charlotte de Berry. He smiled at the thought of the other pirates' faces when they saw the prize he and Sam had taken with just a handful of men. Bards were sure to write songs of this adventure. Within a few moments, almost the entire lot of passengers had boarded the longboats. Cough. Bart quickly turned toward the large crate behind him. The cough came from inside the crate. Bart pulled his pistol from his belt and slowly took a step toward it. The crate was well made, but still there were knotholes and spaces between the boards. Bart stopped and stared hard at one of those knotholes. Movement. He saw something pass behind the hole. "Enemy in the crates!" Bart yelled, and then fired a round from his pistol at the knothole. A man screamed in pain from inside. Bart fired again. Suddenly, armed men burst from many of the crates, firing as they came. The whole side of the crate that Bart had fired into came crashing down as 4 men rushed out with rifles and pistols. Bart pulled a second pistol from his waist and met them head-on, firing round after round until the chambers were empty. His crew were shocked as bullets exploded around them. They returned fire but were untrained combatants and haphazardly scattered about. Bart could feel the sizzle of rounds miraculously only grazing his body as he strode at the one man remaining alive from the crate he was in front of. Their pistols were both empty, and they grappled and spun back into the crate. Bart was slammed into the back wall by the man dressed in a military uniform of white pants and long blue jacket that featured white chest straps in the shape of an X. The man slammed his fist into Bart's cheek and pulled it back for another blow. Bart was able to move his head just in time, and the man's hand landed hard against the wooden wall of the crate. Bart twisted his body away from the man, then spun back with an elbow strike to the man's jaw. He stumbled backward, and Bart was able to catch his breath for 2 seconds before the man pulled a knife and lunged at him. Blocking the man's knife hand, Bart was able to shoulder underneath him and hold onto the man's wrist. barely keeping the blade from slicing into his chest. He pressed the man against the back wall of the crate, one arm under the chin against his throat, the other keeping the knife from stabbing into his flesh. Their faces were so close Bart could smell onions on the man's breath. Roberts knew that the knife was getting closer to him. He felt the tip of the blade against his linen shirt. He needed to do something quick before it skewered him like a piece of meat. Bart tilted his head back, then smashed his forehead against the man's nose. He felt and heard the crunch of cartilage, and when he opened his eyes, the man's face was filling with blood. The blow stunned and took the fight out of the man long enough for Bart to strike him several times with his knee. Bart wrestled the blade from the man's hands and stuck it into his gut several times before letting him slide down to the floor of the crate in a pool of blood. When it was over, Roberts noticed the frantic yelling and booms of gunfire happening around him. He quickly knelt and began to reload his pistols. The mechanics of opening the chamber, dropping out the spent rounds and replacing them with live ones was quite simple, but it was still unfamiliar to him. Also, his hands were shaking from the adrenaline leaving his body after the fight for his life. A uniformed man appeared suddenly in the opening of the crate. He held a rifle, which he quickly brought to bear when he saw the pirate. Roberts braced for the impact of a bullet and cringed when a shot rang out. The soldier slumped over and crumpled to the planking, dead. Bart looked up and saw his crooked-nosed mate, Francis, smiling at him with a smoking rifle at his hip. The two men then moved from cover to cover to get back on the side of the friendlies while the enemy hid behind crates and in an organized way took pot shots at the pirates. Bart saw where Sam and others were gathered on the forecastle. It was good they had the high ground, but these enemy soldiers were fine shots, and the deck was littered with the bodies of his crewmen. They made it to the hoist and were in a good cover spot, but to run across the open deck to the staircase would be suicide. He looked over the railing into the bay. The longboats with the passengers were 100 yards away and were passing several boats loaded with more rifle-carrying soldiers heading to join the fight. It would only be minutes before they would be overrun. Bart desperately looked around for a solution. He spotted the oil lamps that sat on top of poles to light the deck in the evenings. He pointed them out to Francis, who looked back confused. "We burned them out of their hiding spots," Bart said. The man looked back at the wooden crates scattered about the deck the soldiers were hiding behind and understood what his captain was thinking. "Send the bastards to hell," he said, nodding. They took down as many lamps as they could reach without getting shot. They lit the lamps, and Bart was the first to launch his to a distant crate. It crashed into the wooden box, and flames burst from the oil as it splashed over it. Bart turned and smiled at this new mate, and then they continued to target the crates, spreading fire throughout the deck. Smoke and flames continued to grow, and the soldiers knew that fire aboard a ship was a horrifying situation. The pirates and their crew watched as the frantic soldiers left the cover of the burning crates to be shot by the pirates or launch themselves over the railing into the bay. Sam and his crew came down the stairs, firing rifles and pistols at the soldiers as they tried to escape the burning deck. Chester directed several men to get a water pump to start battling the fire once their enemy was dead or overboard. In a matter of minutes, the deck was aflame, and the soldiers left alive were swimming toward the oncoming boats filled with more armed men. Those men sent covering fire at the pirates and attempted to rescue their swimming companions. "Sam, you and these men keep them busy. The rest of us, we need to get this fire out," Roberts said as smoke was filling the area. Sam and 12 men lined the rail, firing aimed rounds at the soldiers until they were able to row out of range. The rest of the crew were desperately trying to put the fire out, and just when it seemed that the blaze was too big to handle, the blessed rain that Bart had seen coming began to fall and fall hard. What had seemed like a lost cause a few minutes ago had now given the men of the Charlotte's fortune a reason to raise their voices in a cheer. They hoisted their rifles, buckets of water, and pistols in the air and let out loud hails of joy. Bart looked around at the men left standing. They had lost 20 or so to this fight, but would still be able to crew the vessel out to sea. His forehead had drying blood on it from having slammed it into the soldier's nose, but otherwise he was alive and unhurt. A wonder that no bullet had ended his life during the battle. He and his crooked-nosed mate Francis had been in the thick of it, bullets flying all around from both sides. It was not his day to die, Roberts surmised. Those Hawaiians were sure to regroup and return in force once they saw that the ship's fire was out. They needed to escape the harbor. "Sam, Let's get the anchors up and the Charlotte's fortune on her way. Chester, take some men and salvage what you can from those crates and put it in the hold. Collect the guns and ammo, then drop the bodies over the side. Clean up my deck. Congratulations, gentlemen. You are all now rich, but we need to escape while we can, so that we can live to spend it. Fire up the boilers, and let's be off. Black Bart Roberts patted a few men on their backs as he headed up the stairs to the pilot house, leaving the smiling men to their work. I hope you're enjoying this historical fiction book with pirates and time travel all wound together in it. You can find the ebook and physical books at my website, briancantrell.com. You can also find the second book in this series, Pirates of World War II. And if you're a fan of pirates, you can check out thepiraterepublic.com. It's a weekly newsletter that I put out every Friday. All sorts of great pirate history, events, news, and happenings. You can also toss a few doubloons our way by joining our Patreon at Patreon, The Pirate Republic. We'll see you next week. Till then, fair winds and keep a weathered eye.